Hello and welcome to this short video, Food Labelling. Now my name's Andy Bowles and I'm a food lawyer, and this is the fourth in a series of 100 videos on the topic of UK food law topics. Now you may be watching this video as part of our online training service, in which case there are more materials available for you to download associated with this video itself, but also there are a number of webinars, typically an hour long, which deal with some of the more complex issues that I'm going to be talking about. There is also some online text-based courses on this, so a huge amount more resource on our online training service. But if you're watching it on YouTube, that's fine as well. Right, I'm going to talk about food labelling, and I'm going to talk in 10 minutes on the labelling requirements for pre-packed foods. So this is pre-packed foods will be foods that are made by, for example, a manufacturer that require the consumer to actually open a package. So we're talking about tins of baked beans, tins of soup, packets of cornflakes. You get the idea. So the sorts of products that you'll buy from a supermarket shelf. Now, the law requires a whole bunch of mandatory information, so law requirements that must be applied in law. Now, of course, some of them are where required, so they don't have to apply it. It just depends on the circumstances. But here we are, is the list behind me. We have the name of the food, the ingredients list, the allergens identified in that ingredients list, the QID declaration, the quantitative ingredient declaration, the net quantity, minimum durability. We have special storage conditions, the name of the business, the country of origin, instructions of use, alcoholic strength, and then lastly, nutrition declaration. So let's go through those each topics very briefly. First of all, the name of the food. Now, the name of the food, every food must be placed on the market. It must have an appropriate name. Some foods will have a legal name, but not many. A legal name is a name that's been set out in law, and when you actually use it, it sort of explains itself. These are typically foods that have standards set out in food standards law for them, compositional standards and labelling standards. So things like jam, things like butter, things like chocolate. If you use the name milk chocolate, well then that's what it is. You don't need to say any more. If it's a strawberry jam, then you are saying what it is because it meets the compositional standards. However, most foods do not have a legal name. So we have a customary name. Now, a customary name is a name that the customer will recognise automatically and doesn't need any further description. Now, there's no law that sets this out. There's no law which defines it beyond that. And in fact, a customary name will vary regionally, because certain foods are known regionally by one name, but regionally in another name. If you've got something like a bread roll in London, if you head up the M6, it'll become a barm cake by the time you hit Manchester, but it's probably been a tea cake on its way. So there are lots of different names for the same food. So customary names can be a little bit misleading. The general principle is you only need to give your food a customary name if everyone pretty much will know what it is. What am I talking about? Spaghetti. That's a customary name. Everyone knows what spaghetti is, probably. Anyway, so you can see the difficulty with customary names. But if you're putting a customary name on your food, some manufacturers just can't be bothered with any of this. They just think, well, actually, we think it's customary, but we don't want to get into a row over it. So what they do is they will use the third category of name. And you'll often see that on pretty much most foods. And that's a descriptive name. Descriptive name is exactly that. It's a brief description of the food so that the consumer, when they look at the descriptive name, understands what it is and they can distinguish it from another product. That's all it is. So a descriptive name you'll find pretty much everywhere. Now remember, a name of the food can't be a brand name. So something like if you pick up a bottle of Coke, everyone knows what Coke is, but you can't use a brand name as a name. It has to be a separate entity. So even if you pick up a bottle of Coke, you look on the label, you'll see a descriptive name on there. Sort of a, sparkling soft drink containing vegetable extracts or something of that nature. So a little descriptive name. So that's the first principle. You must have a name of the food. Now, there are some additional requirements. If your food contains artificial sweeteners, for example, the name of the food must include that. So you'll find, a food with sweetener in the name. Or if it contains sugars and sweeteners, then you need to include that in the name. There are other requirements that need to be included in the name, but we haven't got time in this video. The next requirement is the ingredients list. Now, the ingredients list must identify the ingredients, and the starting basic principle is you list out the ingredients in the weight descending order that they were used in the making of the food. It's a sort of mixing bowl stage, they call it. So in other words, if you were making a cake and you were putting in flour and you were putting in eggs and you're putting in raisins and you're putting in whatever else you put into cakes, then literally as you mix it up, you would declare the ingredients at the greatest. The flour is going to be the greatest, and maybe sugar might be the next one, maybe eggs might be the next one, whatever. Now, the names of the ingredients should be the names as if they were being sold individually, so the consumer can understand what they are. They shouldn't be sort of abbreviations or anything like that. They should be spelt out in full. On an ingredients list, you need to declare everything that goes into that food must be pretty much put on the ingredients list itself. It must be preceded by the words ingredients. And as a top tip, one of the things that will happen when an enforcement officer looks at your label is they'll quickly look at the ingredients list. They'll just see whether there is an obvious weight descending order, just in terms of logic. They'll look at the name of the food and they'll see whether there's anything in the name of the food or any pictures on the ingredients that's not in your ingredients list. These are sort of easy things to check. So everything must be listed out. There are exemptions for foods that don't require ingredients lists, and there are exemptions for a whole range of categories of ingredients that can be lumped together, but a bit too detailed for this video. Additives. If you're putting an additive in a food, now remember, a food additive, there is a separate video on this, could be something like a colour, could be a stabiliser, could be a sweetener, then you always have to put the category of additive first in the ingredients list, followed by its name or number. So the name might be, colour, it might be, you're going to see an example there, thickener, guar gum. Or it could be thickener and then the E number for guar gum. So it's entirely up to the manufacturer whether you do that, but you must always put the right category name, thickener, colour, sweetener, whatever it might be. In terms of allergens, which is the next requirement, but it links into the previous one, there are 14 allergens that are listed in law that must be declared on a food label. And these are cereals containing gluten, crustaceans, fish, eggs, peanuts, soybeans, milk, nuts, and the nuts are different from peanuts. Remember, peanuts are ground nuts, where the other nuts are mentioned are tree nuts. So you don't just use the generic term nuts ever for peanuts, they are separate. And the nuts are specified in law, hazelnuts, walnuts, cashews, and so forth. We have celery, we have mustard, sesame seeds, sulfur dioxide, but only at levels above 10 milligram per kilogram, lupins and mollusks. So the requirement is, on a food label, in your ingredients list, you list out, you identify the allergen. It must use the name as listed on that previous slide. So, if you're going to put on, for example, nuts, you must name the nut, not just put nuts in your ingredients list. If you're putting milk, then it's milk. And wherever it appears in your ingredients list, even if it appears multiple times, it must be given emphasis. Now, the emphasis is up to you. On that example behind me, you might be able to see it. It might not be emphasized that well. It's in bold text, which is fine. It might not need to be bold. It could be italics, it could be capitals, it could be bold, italics and capitals. It's entirely up to you how you do it. But if any of those 14 allergens appear in your food, they must be given special emphasis in the ingredients list. And then you might want to put underneath, it's not a legal requirement, but you might want to put underneath, it's a recommended practice, allergy advice. For allergens, please see ingredients in bold. You might want to put a precautionary allergen labelling, so something along the lines of, if manufacturing equipment that also processes peanuts, nuts, soy, wheat, egg, milk, whatever. If you're using precautionary allergen labelling, then you must have undertaken a risk assessment first. If you're just putting it on there because you think you'll protect yourself by putting on may contain peanuts, just in case a peanut falls in there, you're not protected in law. Take it from me. So when you're dealing with precautionary allergen labelling, the issue is, first of all, undertake a risk assessment. make sure all food allergens are properly managed, and there is a short video on management of food allergens. If there is a residual risk of the allergen being present after you've taken all reasonable precautions and exercised all due diligence with respect to food allergens, but there is nothing else you can do, then you provide information, and that's precautionary allergen labelling. Just putting on may contain peanuts because you think, well, if one turns up, I'll be protected, helps you not, I'm afraid. So anyway, there we are. There's no requirement in law. In fact, it would be quite unlawful for you to put an allergy box. All allergens must be within the ingredients list. Okay, QID, the quantity of ingredient declaration, is basically the percentage in the ingredients list or with the name of the food. You can do either. Most people tend to do it in the ingredients list of ingredients that appear in the name of the food or given special emphasis in the food or are characterized. So, for example, just to make the point, if I've got a vanilla flavored mixed nut and seed bar, so a vanilla flavored mixed nut and seed bar, you've got the customer expectation of what ingredients will be present, but you've got actual ingredients mentioned. You've got mixed nuts. So by saying nuts, you'll need to QID. In other words, put the percentage of the ingredient of each of the nuts. That triggers QID. So the QID percentage declaration after an ingredient is often triggered by what you call the food. So your descriptive name may say it's a mixed nut and seed bar, in which case you'll have to QID the seeds and the nuts. But if it is obviously a cereal bar, you don't necessarily, if you've not called it, you should have to call it that. But even the customer expectation would be, the cereal should be QIDed. Hopefully you get the idea there. Net quantity, well, you put it in terms of whatever it is, milligrams, millilitres, kilograms, inappropriate, that's on the label. Durability marking, we have different types, and there are separate videos on this which explain the difference between best before and use by. There's also a separate video available within the 100 on shelf life determination. But basically you've got this best before end, use by. There is also a requirement set in the law for date of first freezing, but there are lots of exemptions on foods that have been previously frozen. Because if you're you're making your Christmas puds now in April, ready for Christmas in December, typically we'll freeze them, but it doesn't actually cause any technological or safety issues. You don't necessarily have to declare that on the label. So there's a big get out of jail issue in relation to frozen foods. But in terms of durability marking, you have a durability mark is the best before date. It's the date until which the food retains its specific properties. So in other words, it's a quality issue. Packet of biscuits, you put a best before date on it just to make sure it's sound at the end of that best before, it's in good quality, it's not all gone soggy. A use by date for highly perishable foods. On expiry of a use by date, the food will become unsafe. There is a separate video on the term unsafe food, but basically it could be injurious to health or harmful to the consumer. So a use by date is very different to a best before date. For best before dates, it's linked into shelf life. So if you're using a best before date, you can have the format best before date month if the shelf life is 3 months or less, best before end month year if the shelf life is greater than 3 months but no more than 18 months, and best before end just the year if the shelf life is greater than 18 months. Move on to special storage conditions. You have special storage conditions for the food itself. So when it's delivered or wherever you bought it, you might want to keep it refrigerated, keep it out of sunlight. So that will only apply if required. And there are other storage conditions if the conditions of storage change after the product's open. So if you think of a carton of milk, it may say, store refrigerated on the carton. Well, that's the first criteria met. But then after opening, consume within 3 days. It might be on there. So that means once you've opened it, well, it will go off if you don't sort of drink it appropriately. The food business operator, the name and address of the food business operator responsible for marketing the food. If you're making foods on behalf of a supermarket, that will be the name of the supermarket. So if it's Tesco's or Sainsbury's or Waitrose or whatever. So if you're manufacturing an own brand good, it's the business responsible for placing that food on the market, the brand name that would actually have their name on there. If it's been made abroad, then it'd be the name of the importer, if it's not an own brand product, that would go on there. Country of origin. Now, this is not there are some foods where country of origin is mandatory, it's required in law, but for most foods it's not. However, if there are a number of things, it's all about misleading the consumer. So if you are putting Union Jacks all over the front of your label, you will need to declare the country of origin if it's not from the UK, for example, just to make sure that they're not being misled. Also, there is a primary ingredient issue. If you said you're supplying products, it's British ham, but the actual pork is coming from, I don't know, Denmark, then that needs to be declared on the label as well. So British ham from Danish pork or something in the name of the food. So country of origin and provenance can be triggered by what you describe the food as, how you present the food, but there are also some mandatory requirements. Instructions for use, well, you only need them there if people would struggle to use the food without it. So if it needs, the most important ones are things like when you have pies or quiches, if they're ready to eat, it should say that. If they require cooking, cooking instructions should be on there. But not all foods, require that sort of thing. Alcoholic strength is only required on alcoholic drinks above 1.2%, but there are some exceptions in terms of wines and things. Yeah, there we are. So that will only apply in terms of alcoholic drinks. Nutrition declaration. Now, it is mandatory on all pre-packed foods that there is a declaration of the nutritional information, but there are some exceptions, of course, as always, and the way it's presented typically be in a table, but there are some exceptions to that. So it can be produced linear form if there's not much space on the label, for example. The mandatory information, the bottom line, you must include energy value and the amounts of fat, saturates, carbohydrates, sugars, protein and salt. So they must be on the label. But there are discretionary additional nutrition information which you can also include. So that would include, it would be fats, of which monosaturates, of which polysaturates. It could be fibre, starch, and if you've got any vitamins and minerals that you put in, once you put the vitamins and minerals, if you name them in the food, if you're adding them in, then they would appear on the label as well. There is also a provision within the law to repeat some information on the front of the pack. Well, it doesn't actually have to be the front, but we often call it front of pack labelling. But it's this sort of traffic light system. You can either just display the energy value on its own, or the energy value with fat, saturated sugar and salt. And it's all declared together with the adult's reference intake and serving size. So you can see how that's provided. The nutritional information table behind me is taken from the regulations, so you won't be able to see it because it's tiny, isn't it? But it is important. If you're putting a food label out there, the most easiest schoolboy error to make, and can be very costly, is just to put the wrong information or in the wrong order. It must be in this order and use these units. So energy, kilojoules, kilocalories, fat, grams, of which saturates, polyunsaturates, monounsaturates, carbohydrate, of which sugars, polyols, starch, fibre, protein, salt, vitamins and minerals. If you're using vitamin and minerals, there are separate legal requirements on how they're displayed, what point they need to be displayed, and also in terms of the actual, again, values that are used. So just make sure on your label, if you're putting one together, you put it in the right order. It's the easiest thing for an enforcement officer. Pick one of your products off, just have a look at it, see the ingredients list in the nutrition information in the wrong order, and that's a red flag. That's saying, well, that's wrong, so what else is wrong? So they'll sample it and send it off to an analyst. That's the most appropriate thing for them to do. Okay, well look, thank you for listening to this one. That's another one struck off the list. So it's one of 100 videos. Please stay tuned to watch another one. Cheers.